Good evening, and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Before tonight's story begins, allow yourself to settle into the quietest position you can find. Let the bed support your weight, soften your shoulders, and release whatever remains of the day. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing more you need to finish tonight. You do not need to follow every detail. Let the words pass slowly around you, like evening air moving through an open window. If sleep comes before the story is finished, you may simply allow it to come. And now, as the last weeks of winter soften the lanes and a low humming continues beneath the straw and weathered wood, we will make our way quietly to Selworthy Combe. In the last weeks of winter, when the rain had softened the lanes and the first pale shoots were beginning to show beneath the hedges, Mr. Bertram Locke came to Selworthy with one leather case, a travelling rug, and a letter from his physician folded carefully inside his pocketbook. The village appeared only gradually as the hired cart climbed from the road below. First, there were bare branches shining with rain, then the low white wall of a garden, and at last a small gathering of pale cottages set beneath steep roofs of weathered thatch. They stood along the slope as though they had grown there among the hollies and the old apple trees. Behind them, Selworthy Combe rose towards the open ground of Exmoor, where last year's heather lay brown beneath a sky the colour of pewter. Bertram had expected the countryside to feel empty. Instead, it seemed full of small, contained sounds: water moving in a ditch, the creak of harness leather, a rook calling from the upper trees, and the soft striking of the horse's shoes on the wet stones. None of these sounds demanded anything from him. That was perhaps why he noticed them. Mrs. Judith Coombe's house stood near the upper edge of the village. It was a modest place, with 2 guest rooms above a parlour and a narrow garden running down behind the kitchen. Mrs. Coombe, a squarely built widow with iron-grey hair, received him without fuss. She showed him a room with a small fireplace, a washstand, a writing table, and a window looking across the roofs towards the wooded side of the combe. "You will find it quiet," she said. Bertram looked at the narrow bed, the clean counterpane, and the single chair placed beside the hearth. "That is what I have been prescribed." Mrs. Coombe gave him a brief, considering glance, as though quiet were a medicine whose effects she had observed before. Then she told him when breakfast was served and left him to unpack. There was little to unpack. Most of his books and heavier suits remained in crates in his sister's attic. He had brought walking clothes, 2 volumes he did not particularly wish to read, his watch, and the physician's instructions. The instructions advised fresh air, plain food, moderate exercise, and freedom from professional responsibility. Bertram had read them until the fold across the paper began to wear thin. They also left nearly every hour unoccupied. For more than 20 years, a bell had divided his mornings into useful portions. There had been registers to examine, masters to consult, letters to answer, boys to correct, parents to reassure, and accounts that never remained settled for long. Even his meals had fitted between obligations. Now there was no bell, and the absence of it seemed louder than any sound in Mrs. Coombe's house. That evening, Bertram arranged his belongings with unnecessary care. He centered the books on the table, aligned his brushes, folded his travelling rug, and set his wound watch on the mantel. With nothing left to arrange, he sat by the fire and listened to rain against the window. He had imagined that retirement would feel like the end of a long term, a closing door, an empty corridor, and the relief of work completed. Instead, it felt as though he had left the school in the middle of a lesson and could still hear the chairs moving behind him. He slept for less than 3 hours. Long before Mrs. Coombe began stirring the kitchen fire, Bertram was awake, dressed, and standing beside the window. The village below was still dark. A faint mist rested among the roofs, and water gleamed in the lane wherever the clouds allowed a little light to pass. He checked his watch twice before remembering that there was no appointment to miss. After several minutes, he put on his coat and went outside. The air was cold enough to make him draw a deeper breath. He followed the lane above the cottages, choosing the steeper path because his physician had written the words "moderate exercise," and because a direction, even an arbitrary one, felt preferable to remaining still. The path carried him between high hedges, past sheep gathered beneath an ash tree, and towards small orchards on the sheltered slope. Frost remained in the shadows, while water dripped from the branches. Somewhere below, the village pump gave a metallic knock. Bertram was passing a gate of dark, unpainted wood when he heard the sound. At first he mistook it for water running beneath the bank. It was low and continuous, not quite a hum, and not quite the movement of wind. He stopped. When he stepped nearer to the gate, the sound became clearer, though he still could not identify its source. Beyond the hedge stood a long timber shelter with a sloping roof. Beneath it was a row of wooden bee houses raised from the damp ground on stone supports. Several old straw skeps rested on an upper shelf, their woven surfaces darkened by years of smoke and weather. Between the shelter and the house, an elderly woman moved slowly from one hive to the next. She wore a thick brown shawl crossed over her chest, a faded skirt, and boots whitened by the dry earth beneath the shelter. In one hand, she carried a small lantern, although dawn was beginning to lift behind the trees. At each hive, she set the lantern down, bent close to the wood, and remained entirely still. Bertram watched her repeat the action 3 times before she looked towards the gate. He felt at once that he had been intruding. He lifted his hat and prepared to continue along the path, but the woman straightened and spoke before he could move away. "You are Mrs. Coombe's new gentleman." It was not a question. Her voice was quiet and practical, with none of the exaggerated welcome that Bertram had come to dread from people who had heard he was unwell. "Bertram Locke," he said, "I hope I have not disturbed you." "You have not disturbed them." She glanced towards the hives, and he understood that the bees, rather than herself, were the subject of concern. The woman introduced herself as Agnes Tarr. When Bertram asked whether something was wrong with the hives, she shook her head. "I am finding out what has continued." She opened the gate, and after a moment's hesitation, Bertram stepped inside. The earth smelled of wet leaves and wood ash. Close to the shelter, the low sound he had heard from the lane separated into several slightly different tones. One hive gave a steady murmur, another seemed almost silent, until Agnes motioned for him to stand nearer. She explained that the bees had not truly slept through winter. They had drawn close together inside the hive, living on the honey stored during the warmer months and keeping the queen warm by their own movement. On mild days, a few might venture out, but until the air softened, the keeper learned what she could without opening the boxes. "Cold enters more quickly than curiosity leaves," Agnes said. Bertram looked along the row. Each hive carried a small painted name rather than a number. Some were nearly worn away: orchard, lower wall, bramble, and brook. The largest hive stood near the middle, beneath a slightly deeper part of the roof. On its front, in faded green letters, were the words, "Old Meg." Agnes placed her palm against its side, then bent her head to listen. After a few seconds, she moved aside. "Try there." Bertram was unsure whether he should touch the wood. He removed his hat, though he could not have said why, and leaned towards the hive. At first he heard nothing but his own breathing. His collar felt too tight. He became aware of the damp ground beneath his boots, and of Agnes, waiting, without impatience, beside him. He held his breath. Then, from somewhere beyond the weathered boards, came a low and gathered humming. It was not the bright summer sound of bees among flowers. This was deeper and more enclosed, a vibration almost felt through the cheek rather than heard by the ear. Thousands of small lives were hidden within the darkness, each moving only enough to preserve the warmth shared by all the others. Bertram listened longer than was necessary. "They are alive," he said at last. "Yes." Agnes lifted the lantern and continued to the next hive. There was no ceremony in her answer, yet Bertram remained beside old Meg for another moment. The hive looked no different than it had before. Its boards were grey. One corner of the roof had been repaired with tin, and no bee appeared at the entrance. To anyone passing on the lane, it might have seemed empty. "Not everything that is quiet has ended," Agnes said, already several steps away. Bertram replaced his hat. He thanked her and returned to the gate while she resumed her progress along the row, listening at each hive as she had done before his arrival. By the time he reached Mrs. Coombe's house, a thin brightness had spread above the coombe. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and somewhere behind one of the cottages, a pail was set down upon stone. The village was waking in small sounds rather than bells. At breakfast, Bertram ate more than expected. Mrs. Coombe asked whether he had found a suitable walk. He mentioned the orchards and Mrs. Tarr. This satisfied her, though she only remarked that Agnes kept earlier hours than sensible people. The day passed quietly. Bertram attempted to read, wrote to his sister, and walked again. Yet he kept remembering the sound inside old Meg. It had not filled the shelter, but it had filled a place in his thoughts lately occupied by the noise of school corridors. That evening, he did not prepare a schedule for the following day. He wound his watch, placed it on the mantel, and allowed the fire to settle without checking the hour. For the first time since leaving Bristol, the coming morning seemed to contain a small purpose that had not been assigned. He still woke before dawn. For a little while he lay beneath the counterpane and listened to the unfamiliar house. A board shifted as it cooled. Wind moved softly around the chimney. From below came the first muted sound of Mrs. Coombe opening the stove. Bertram dressed, put on his coat, and stepped into the pale morning. At the end of the lane, he turned uphill towards the orchards once more. This time, he could no longer pretend that he had chosen the path by accident. On the second morning, Agnes did not appear surprised to see Bertram at the gate. She was sweeping dead leaves from the stone supports beneath the hives, working with a narrow birch broom whose handle had been polished smooth by long use. When he lifted his hat, she nodded towards old Meg, as though acknowledging that he had returned to hear the bees rather than to visit her. The hive sounded much as it had the morning before. Bertram leaned close, held his breath, and found the low murmur more quickly this time. It seemed no louder, yet it no longer felt hidden from him. Agnes continued sweeping while he listened. Neither of them attempted to turn the moment into a lesson. Afterwards he remained near the shelter for several minutes, uncertain whether courtesy required him to leave. Agnes gathered the damp leaves into a basket and carried them towards a compost heap beside the orchard wall. She did not invite him to stay, but neither did she close the gate. Bertram took this as permission to watch until the cold reached his fingers, and then he returned to Mrs. Coombe's house for breakfast. So began a habit that neither of them formally arranged. On dry mornings, Bertram walked to the apiary before the village was fully awake. If rain sounded heavily against his window, he waited until it softened. Agnes was usually there before him, moving among the hives with the calm economy of someone who had performed the same tasks through so many seasons that no gesture required consideration. On others, Agnes spoke a few sentences about the wind, the dampness beneath the hive stands, or the need to clear grass from the entrances before it grew tall. Bertram listened. He had already discovered that silence did not make Agnes uncomfortable, and this allowed him to rest from the habit of producing conversation merely because another person was present. Mrs. Coombe noticed his new routine. She began leaving his walking boots beside the kitchen range when they were wet, and sometimes delayed breakfast until she heard the garden door open upon his return. One morning, as she poured tea, she asked whether Agnes had put him to work yet. "I do not believe she has decided what use I might be." Mrs. Coombe set the teapot down. "If she lets you stand near the hives, she has decided you are not entirely useless." From her, Bertram learned that the apiary belonged partly to the village. Agnes kept several colonies of her own, but many of the hives had been entrusted to her by other households. A family with an orchard might wish to keep bees, yet have neither the knowledge nor the time to inspect them. Another might inherit a hive along with a cottage. Agnes tended the colonies together, and after the harvest, the honey was divided according to an understanding older than any written account. Some families supplied jars, others repaired woodwork, brought clean straw, or lent a cart when hives had to be moved. The arrangement sounded imprecise to Bertram. He asked whether anyone kept a proper record of these exchanges. Mrs. Coombe regarded him over the rim of her cup. "Agnes does. In a ledger, in her head." This answer troubled the part of Bertram that had spent years insisting every school expense be entered twice, and every absence accompanied by an explanation. Yet the jars apparently reached the correct cupboards each autumn, and no one in Selworthy seemed anxious about the absence of a ledger. As the days lengthened, the apiary began to change. Sunlight reached beneath the shelter earlier in the morning. Frost still silvered the shaded grass, but water no longer remained frozen in the shallow stone trough near the gate. Hazel catkins loosened along the lanes, and the tips of the willow branches near the stream took on a soft yellow cast. On the first mild morning, a single bee emerged from the hive named Orchard. It paused at the entrance, cleaned its antennae with its forelegs, and lifted into the air. Bertram watched it circle once, before disappearing beyond the roof of the shelter. He expected Agnes to show some pleasure at the sight. She merely followed the bee with her eyes and moved a small stone that had rolled too near the entrance. "One warm hour does not make spring," she said. Before noon, clouds returned and the wind turned cold. The bee came back while Bertram was still there, entering the hive with nothing visible on its legs. Agnes seemed more satisfied by its return than she had been by its departure. On another morning, 3 bees flew from Lower Wall and travelled in the direction of the stream. Later, one returned bearing 2 small loads of pale gold pollen. Agnes bent close enough to see the colour and said it had found willow. Bertram looked towards the distant line of trees. The willows themselves were barely visible from the apiary, yet their flowering had been carried back upon the body of a creature no larger than the end of his thumb. For the first time, he understood that the entrances to the hives offered a view of more than the colonies within. If one watched carefully, they revealed what was happening across the whole comb. He began counting the bees that left Old Meg. He counted 27 in 1 minute, 32 in the next, and 24 after a cloud passed over the sun. In the absence of paper, he arranged the numbers in his memory, intending to compare them with those from Orchard. Agnes allowed him to continue for some time before asking, "What will the number tell you?" Bertram lost his count. Whether the colony is active, you can see that without counting. Then perhaps whether it is more active than the others. And what will you do when you know? He had no answer. At school, numbers had always led to judgments. Marks ordered boys from strongest to weakest. Attendance figures revealed discipline. Accounts indicated success or failure. Here he had begun collecting numbers simply because counting felt like a form of competence. Agnes pointed towards Old Meg's entrance. A worker had landed awkwardly on the board, its hind legs heavy with pollen of a deeper orange than the willow pollen. It rested before walking inside. "That one tells you more than 27, she said. Bertram stopped counting. He learned instead to notice the different work taking place at the hive entrance. Some bees returned from the lanes and orchards. Others carried fragments of debris from within the hive and dropped them over the edge of the landing board. Guard bees stood near the opening and touched returning workers with their antennae. On warmer afternoons, several young bees faced the hive and flew in widening curves, fixing the position of their home before traveling farther. Agnes called these their learning flights. Bertram found himself smiling at the expression. He had supervised thousands of lessons, but none had looked so free. The young bees appeared to wander, yet every circle brought them a clearer knowledge of where they belonged. He also learned how quickly activity changed with the weather. A patch of sunlight could draw bees from 3 hives at once. A cold gust sent them home. Before fine rain reached the orchard, the outward flights diminished, and the entrances became crowded with returning workers. Agnes never claimed that bees predicted weather with certainty. They responded to signs people often failed to notice. They do not know the future, she told him. They are only paying attention to the present. During these mornings, he usually stood near the end of the shelter, careful not to block the flight paths. His strength had improved since his arrival, though sleep still came irregularly, and his legs sometimes felt weak after the climb. He concealed this as he had concealed fatigue at school, shifting his weight or pretending to examine the orchard whenever dizziness passed briefly through him. Agnes appeared not to notice until a morning when the ground was soft after rain. Bertram had been standing for nearly an hour while she repaired a strip of roofing felt above Brook Hive. When he moved aside to let her pass, his boot slipped slightly, and he caught the edge of the shelter with one hand. Agnes said nothing. She took a three-legged wooden stool from beneath the workbench, removed a basket of twine and tools from its seat, and placed it several paces from old Meg. Then she returned to the roof, as though the stool had always been intended to stand there. Bertram looked at it. The seat was worn into a shallow curve, and one leg bore the marks of an old repair. He understood the offer, but hesitated. Sitting while an elderly woman continued working offended some deeply rooted principle of usefulness. "The bees will not think less of you," Agnes said without turning. He sat. From the lower position, the apiary looked different. He could see the landing boards clearly and follow the bees against the pale grass beyond. The stool was not comfortable, but it was steady. After several minutes, the tightness in his legs eased, and his attention returned from his own body to the movement at the hives. Agnes finished the repair, gathered the loose nails, and sat for a moment on an upturned wooden box. Together they watched a broad shadow pass over the shelter as clouds traveled across the sun. Almost at once, the bees changed their flight, descending more directly towards the entrances. Bertram did not ask what the change meant. He waited. When the light returned, the outward traffic gradually resumed. Agnes gave a small nod, as though he had answered a question by remaining silent. Thereafter, the stool waited for him beside old Meg. Bertram never referred to it as his, and Agnes never said that it was. If a basket rested on the seat when he arrived, she moved it before beginning her work. If rain had blown beneath the shelter, she wiped the wood with the corner of a sack. The courtesy was so practical that it could easily have passed unnoticed, yet Bertram noticed it each morning. He began to understand that Agnes rarely expressed welcome by speaking of it. She made a place, left it open, and trusted the other person to recognize what had been done. One evening, after a day of cold rain, Bertram looked from his bedroom window towards the dark line of the orchards. He could not see the apiary, though he knew where it stood. The bees would be gathered within their hives, and the three-legged stool would be waiting beneath the shelter. The following morning, thin sunlight lay across the wet lane. When Bertram reached the gate, Agnes was already beside old Meg. The stool stood several paces away, empty and dry, with no basket upon it. Bertram entered, closed the gate gently behind him, and took his accustomed place. The morning when Agnes finally opened old Meg began with sunlight on the upper orchard. It reached across the slope before breakfast, touching the wet branches and warming the white walls of the cottages below. During the night, several apple buds had loosened. Their folded petals showed pink at the tips, and the air carried the faint green scent of leaves beginning to unfold. Bertram found a folded veil resting upon the three-legged stool. It was made of dark netting sewn to the brim of an old straw hat. Beside it lay a pair of gloves and a length of clean cloth. Agnes was at the workbench, filling a small metal smoker with dry wood shavings and pieces of old sacking. "Is that for me?" Bertram asked. "Unless you believe the stool intends to wear it." He picked up the veil. Agnes had mended 2 tiers with black thread, and the crown carried a faint smell of smoke and dried lavender. Putting it on made the apiary appear through a fine mesh, as though the morning had been drawn upon paper. Agnes had waited through several mild days before deciding the colonies could bear inspection. She explained that warmth in the sun was not enough. The air itself must be gentle, the wind light, and the bees active enough to repair the disturbance after the hive was closed. Opening too soon allowed the cold to settle over the brood. Bertram glanced at the row of hives. For weeks he had wanted to see what lay inside them. Now that the moment had arrived, his curiosity was accompanied by a nervousness he had not expected. The low sound beneath the roofs belonged to thousands of living creatures whose order he could not yet understand. He feared harming them through ignorance more than he feared being stung. Agnes lit the smoker with a match cupped against the breeze. The shavings caught reluctantly. She worked the bellows until a thin thread of pale smoke emerged from the spout, then held her palm above it. "The smoke should be cool enough to touch," she said. "We are calming them, not cooking them." She handed the smoker to Bertram and showed him how slowly the bellows should be pressed. He gave one careful puff, followed by another that sent far too much smoke across the landing board. Agnes took the smoker back until the cloud had dispersed. People often do too much when they are afraid they have not done enough. Bertram looked at her, but she was already directing 2 light puffs beneath the edge of old Meg's roof. The words had been offered as practical instruction. Still, they followed him as he moved to the other side of the hive. At school, additional effort had been his answer to every difficulty. If examinations were poor, he arranged more lessons. If discipline weakened, he increased supervision. When exhaustion first began to cloud his thoughts, he arrived earlier and worked later, believing that the proper cure for failing strength was stricter use of what remained. Agnes waited a moment, then lifted the outer cover. Beneath it lay a square of thick cloth, darkened by resin along the edges. The bees' murmur rose slightly. Bertram tightened his grip on the smoker. "Listen before you look," Agnes said. They remained still. The sound was fuller than it had been through the closed boards, but not sharp or agitated. Agnes folded back one corner of the cloth and gave the smallest breath of smoke across the top of the frames. The interior revealed itself slowly. First, Bertram saw only moving backs, brown and amber in the filtered sunlight. Then the separate forms became clear, workers passing over one another, antennae touching, wings briefly catching the light. They did not move at random. Paths opened and closed across the comb, each bee occupied with a task whose purpose remained invisible to him. Agnes loosened the first frame with a flat steel tool and lifted it straight upwards. A sheet of honeycomb hung within the wooden rectangle, crowded on both sides. Bertram had seen pieces of comb on breakfast tables, but never an entire frame warm from the hive. The wax varied from pale cream near the edges to deep brown, where many generations of bees had emerged. Agnes held it over the open box so that no bee dislodged from the comb would fall outside. She asked Bertram what he saw. "Bees," he answered, and heard the inadequacy of the word. "Look at what they have covered." He forced his attention past the movement. Along the upper corners, cells had been sealed with flat caps of clean white wax. Below them was a band of open cells containing liquid that shone when the frame tilted. Near the center, the cappings were duller and arranged in a broad oval. Agnes explained that the white upper cells held stored honey. The shining cells contained nectar not yet reduced and sealed. The central oval covered developing worker bees. Pollen filled an uneven ring between the brood and the honey, its colors ranging from straw yellow to rusty orange. What had seemed a confusion of insects became a map. Food surrounded the young. Empty polished cells waited for the queen. Workers moved between regions with an order no straight line could have improved. Bertram asked how she knew whether the colony was healthy. Instead of answering, Agnes turned the frame towards the sun and asked him to describe the brood pattern. He said it was dense near the center and thinner towards the edges. She nodded. A healthy queen laid in a compact area, leaving few empty cells among those of the same age. Scattered brood could indicate trouble, though no single sign should be judged alone. On the next frame, Agnes showed him small white larvae curled in pools of food. Bertram leaned closer. Their existence seemed improbable. Delicate forms inside open wax cells, dependent upon warmth, weather, flowers, and the labor of bees he had previously regarded as indistinguishable.
"Do you see eggs?"
Agnes asked. He searched until his eyes watered behind the veil. At first, every empty cell looked the same. Then sunlight entered one at an angle, revealing a white mark no larger than a thread standing at its base. "One," he said. "There are many. Finding the first teaches your eye what it is looking for." He found another, and then several more. Satisfaction rose in him with the old familiarity of solving a difficult problem, but there was no prize attached to this discovery, and no one else to rank below him. The eggs had been present whether he saw them or not. Agnes moved through the frames without hurry. Bertram supplied smoke when she requested it, learning to wait after each gentle press of the bellows. Once, a bee settled upon the back of his glove. His instinct was to shake it away. Agnes told him to lower his hand and remain still. The bee walked across one knuckle, cleaned its wings, and flew. By the time they reached the center of the hive, the air around them was rich with warm wax, honey, smoke, and the faint animal scent of the colony. Apple petals drifted from a branch above the shelter, though most of the blossoms had not yet opened. Agnes found the queen on the 7th frame. She was longer than the workers, her abdomen moving over the comb with a measured purpose. The surrounding bees made space around her without forming anything so obvious as a procession. Bertram had expected a queen to appear commanding. Instead, her importance could be understood only through the behavior of those around her. They examined no more than necessary. Agnes returned each frame in its former order, lowered the cloth, and replaced the cover. The bees' sound settled gradually beneath the roof. "That is all?" Bertram asked. "That is enough." Several hives remained in the row, but Agnes did not open them immediately. She sat on an overturned box and poured water from a stone bottle into a tin cup. Bertram took his place on the stool. His shoulders ached from holding the smoker with such concentration. Agnes recorded nothing, yet she reviewed aloud what they had seen. Stored honey sufficient for the present, fresh nectar arriving, a compact brood pattern, eggs proving the queen had laid within recent days, and enough adult bees to cover the developing young through a cold night. Bertram repeated the details in the same order, as though memorizing the principal points of a lecture. "You need not examine them," Agnes said. "They will not ask you questions tomorrow. I might ask myself." She considered this and passed him the water bottle. They opened 2 more colonies later that morning. Orchard was smaller but orderly. Brook had fewer stores, so Agnes exchanged the position of one honey frame with a fuller frame from a stronger colony. She explained that assistance should correct a shortage without concealing its cause. They would watch Brook's entrance to see whether its foragers increased as more flowers opened. Bertram began to understand that inspection did not end when the cover was replaced. What they found inside changed what must be observed outside during the following days. At Old Meg, the bees resumed their flights almost immediately. Foragers returned with fresh pollen, while young workers stood near the entrance, moving their wings to carry air through the hive. Bertram watched from the stool, now able to imagine the frames behind the wooden wall. Before he left, Agnes handed him a small piece of wax, scraped from the edge of a frame. It was soft from the hive, and marked with the faint shapes of unfinished cells. "For remembering what you saw," she said. Bertram placed it carefully inside the breast pocket of his coat. Over the next mornings, Agnes allowed him to assist with more inspections. His movements became less abrupt. He learned to set down the smoker where it would not roll, to keep frames above the open hive, and to stand where his shadow did not fall across the bees. He also learned that confidence was not the same as speed. The season advanced around them. Apple blossoms opened across the orchard until the branches appeared to hold small clouds. Bees from every hive crossed above the shelter, and the sound of their work extended beyond the apiary into the trees. Old Meg grew rapidly. The frames that had held empty cells soon filled with brood and nectar. On one inspection, Agnes paused over several wax cups hanging near the lower edge of a frame. They were larger than ordinary cells and pointed downwards. She did not remove them. Instead, she replaced the frame and closed the hive with particular care. "Queen cells?" Bertram asked, remembering the shape from her explanation. Agnes nodded. Old Meg was preparing for the possibility of division. If the colony continued to strengthen and the weather remained mild, the old queen might leave with thousands of workers to seek another home. That afternoon, Agnes took one of the straw skeps from the upper shelf. She examined its woven sides, repaired a loose coil, and placed it beneath the workbench with a folded white sheet and a length of rope. Bertram watched without asking when it would be needed. He had learned that the bees would not consult a timetable. On his walk back to Mrs. Coombe's house, the wind carried apple petals across the lane. Some settled on his shoulders, and one caught against the button of his coat. When he reached into his pocket, his fingers found the piece of warm-colored wax Agnes had given him. For once, he did not think of the hive as a problem awaiting correction. It was a living order preparing to change, and his task was not to prevent that change, but to be attentive when it came. In the days after the queen cells appeared, Bertram came to recognize a new restlessness around old Meg. The hive entrance was crowded even in the cool part of the morning. Workers gathered along the landing board and hung beneath it in a small brown curtain, while others made short, uncertain flights and returned without pollen. Agnes did not open the colony again. She watched from beside the shelter, occasionally placing her hand against the wall to feel the movement within. The old skep remained beneath the workbench. A white sheet had been washed, dried, and folded beside it. Nearby stood a short ladder, a low table, and a soft bristled brush bound with twine around its handle. The preparations made Bertram expect the swarm each time sunlight reached the orchard. He arrived ready to respond, then spent the morning watching ordinary flights continue. By midday, he would begin to suspect that he had misunderstood the signs. Agnes never appeared disappointed. "They will leave when the colony is ready," she told him, "not when the equipment is." Several more mornings passed. The last apple blossoms opened, their petals thinning from pink to white. Bees worked among them in such numbers that the orchard itself seemed to hum. Then the earliest petals began to loosen, falling upon the grass and collecting in the rain gutter above the apiary. Bertram's sleep had improved, though not steadily. Some nights he rested for 6 hours. On others he woke with his thoughts already arranged around duties that no longer belonged to him. Yet the mornings beside old Meg gave each day a point towards which he could move. He no longer studied his physician's instructions before breakfast. Moderate exercise and fresh air had ceased to be assignments. They had become the road to the apiary. The swarm came during a warm afternoon, when neither Agnes nor Bertram was expecting it immediately. They had inspected Brook in the morning and found its stores increasing. Afterwards, Agnes went inside to mend a torn veil. Bertram remained on the three-legged stool, cleaning dried resin from the flat steel tool. The air was still, and sunlight lay across the orchard in broad, pale bands. Old Meg's sound changed. It began as a rising note beneath the roof, so gradual that Bertram first mistook it for the approach of wind. Within moments it deepened and spread through the shelter. Bees poured from the entrance, crossing one another in a rapid stream before lifting above the hive. Bertram stood so quickly that the stool fell behind him. The air filled with bees. They circled above the orchard path, catching the sunlight as they turned. Their movement was too large for him to follow as separate creatures. It resembled smoke released into a shaft of light, except that every particle possessed its own direction and contributed to the sound gathering over the garden. His first impulse was to retreat beneath the shelter. He remembered the weight of the colony upon the frames and imagined that weight transformed into flight around his uncovered hands and face. Agnes emerged, carrying the veil she had been mending. She stopped near the doorway and looked upwards. There was no alarm in her expression. "Old Meg?" Bertram asked. "Old Meg?" She told him to put on his veil, but not to light the smoker. A swarming colony had filled itself with honey before leaving, and was concerned chiefly with following its queen. Unless crushed or sharply disturbed, the bees were unlikely to defend a home they had already abandoned. The explanation steadied him. He retrieved the fallen stool, then stood beside Agnes as they watched the cloud move beyond the shelter. The bees rose above one apple tree, drifted towards the wall, and returned. Their flight seemed chaotic, yet its center traveled slowly across the orchard. "We follow the center," Agnes said. "The edges will follow it too." Bertram carried the skep and folded sheet. Agnes brought the ladder, brush, and low table. They crossed the grass without hurrying. The swarm's sound was loud enough to be felt in his chest, but fear gave way to concentration as Agnes pointed out how the circling mass gradually lowered towards an old apple tree near the boundary wall. The first bees settled on a branch scarcely higher than Agnes's head. Others gathered around them, clinging to the bark and to one another. The cloud thinned as more bees joined the growing cluster. Within several minutes, a shape like a dark pear hung beneath the branch. Bertram had never seen so many living creatures become still at once. A few continued to fly around the tree, but most formed a dense surface that shifted slowly as bees changed places. Somewhere near the center was the old queen, hidden by the workers that had followed her from the hive. Agnes examined the branch. It was low enough to reach from the ladder, though the ground beneath was uneven. Bertram unfolded the white sheet and spread it below the cluster, smoothing the corners with stones. He placed the low table in the center and set the skep upon it. The plan was simple. Agnes would hold the skep beneath the branch, while Bertram gave the limb a firm shake. If the queen fell inside, the workers would gather around her. If she remained on the tree, the cluster would form again, and they would try once more. Bertram looked at the moving weight above them. Simplicity did not make the task feel small. Agnes climbed 2 steps and raised the skep. Bertram placed one hand against the ladder until she shook her head. "The branch, Mr. Locke. I can hold myself." He took the branch with both hands. The bark was rough and warm from the sun. "Once," Agnes said. Bertram pulled down and released. The branch sprang upwards. Most of the cluster dropped into the straw skep with a heavy, soft sound, like grain poured into a basket. Bees scattered across the sheet and rose around their shoulders. Bertram held still, though every instinct urged him to brush them from his sleeves. Agnes lowered the skep onto the table and tilted one edge with a small piece of wood, leaving a dark opening at the bottom. Then there was nothing to do but step back. For several minutes, the result remained uncertain. Bees covered the sheet, crossed the legs of the table, and circled the apple tree. A smaller cluster still clung to the branch. Bertram wondered whether the queen had remained above. Agnes did not guess. She watched the bees nearest the skep. One worker stopped at the raised edge, turned towards the orchard, and lifted its abdomen. Its wings moved rapidly without carrying it into flight. Another bee adopted the same posture, then several more. "They are calling the others," Agnes said. "The queen is inside." Bertram knelt at the edge of the sheet. The scattered bees began to change direction. What had appeared to be wandering became a slow movement towards the opening beneath the skep. Streams formed across the white cloth, joined one another, and disappeared into the shadow. The cluster on the branch loosened. Bees lifted away in groups and descended towards the table. The air remained full of flight, but the center of movement had shifted from the tree to the straw basket. Agnes sat on the grass. Bertram joined her, leaving enough distance between himself and the sheet. His hands had begun to tremble now that they were no longer required to act. He rested them upon his knees and watched the bees enter their temporary shelter. "I nearly stepped backwards," he admitted. "But you did not. I did not have time to consider it properly. That may have helped." They waited through the remainder of the afternoon. Agnes refused to hurry the bees by brushing them towards the entrance. Any worker separated from the queen needed time to find the scent of the others. The gathering could be guided, but not commanded. As the sun moved westward, the sheet gradually cleared. Bertram fetched water and bread from Agnes's kitchen. They ate beneath the apple tree while the last bees settled. Petals drifted onto the white cloth and remained where the insects had been. When the swarm was quiet inside the skep, Agnes covered it with a cloth. They carried it together to the apiary, Bertram holding one side of the board beneath it. An empty wooden hive had been prepared at the far end of the shelter. Agnes arranged clean frames inside it and spread the white sheet from the ground to the entrance like a path. Near dusk, they turned the skep gently and released the colony onto the cloth. The bees moved uphill towards their new home. Bertram saw no leader among them, yet their many small decisions produced one direction. Gradually they crossed the threshold, filling the box with the same deep sound he had first heard beneath old Meg's weathered walls. Agnes placed the cover on the new hive, but left its entrance wide enough for stragglers. She would not name the colony until it had remained for several days. A court swarm could still depart if it found the new shelter unsuitable. They returned the ladder and table to the shed. Bertram realized he was holding the soft brush backwards, gripping the bristles while the handle pointed towards the floor. Agnes looked at it, then at him. Their laughter was quiet at first, but the long concentration of the afternoon gave it strength. Bertram could not remember the last time he had laughed without first deciding whether the occasion permitted it. His coat was marked with grass and pollen. One sleeve carried a streak of soil from the ladder. He was tired in every limb, yet the tiredness felt different from the exhaustion he had known in Bristol. It had a clear beginning, a useful purpose, and an end. At Mrs. Coombe's house, he ate supper, climbed the stairs, and placed his watch upon the mantel without winding it. Rain began lightly after dark, touching the thatch above his room. Bertram lay down intending to think once more about the swarm. Before he could arrange the afternoon into lessons, sleep came. When he woke, sunlight was already showing around the curtains. For the first time since arriving in Selworthy, he had not heard Mrs. Coombe light the stove, nor counted the church bell through the hours before dawn. He dressed and walked quickly towards the apiary. The new colony had remained. Young bees hovered before the entrance, facing the hive as they moved through small circles and widening arcs. Agnes was watching from beside the shelter. Bertram took his seat on the three-legged stool and followed their learning flights against the morning sky. Each circle carried them farther from the hive, and each return brought them back to the same doorway. By the time they flew beyond the apple trees, they had begun to know where home was. The swarm remained in its new hive. During the first days, Bertram watched for signs that it might depart. workers clustering at the entrance, an abrupt stillness, or another sudden rising into the air. Instead, the colony began carrying pale wax beneath its bodies and returning with pollen from the lower meadows. When Agnes opened it briefly, new comb had already appeared along the frames in clean white curves. Several evenings later, Agnes allowed him to lift one corner of the new hive while she judged its weight. The colony had begun with no stores, no brood, and no built comb, yet its workers had already changed the balance of the box. Bertram found this accumulation more impressive than the swarm. Nothing announced each cell or each drop of nectar. The change became visible only after many journeys had been added together. He wrote this in the notebook, then crossed out the word progress because it sounded too much like a school report. In its place, he wrote increase through repeated work. Agnes read the phrase and said the bees would not care what he called it, provided he remembered to leave them enough room. She still did not give the colony a name. A name, she said, ought to describe something that lasted longer than a week. For the present, it was simply the new hive beneath the apple tree. The orchard changed around it. Fallen petals disappeared into the grass. Leaves broadened on the branches, and small hard fruits formed where the flowers had been. Beyond the village, clover spread through the pastures in white and rose-colored patches. Bramble blossoms opened along the hedges, and bees returned to the apiary, powdered with pollen, almost gray in the morning light. The days became fuller, though their fullness bore little resemblance to the crowded life Bertram had known in Bristol. There were hives to observe, frames to prepare, grass to cut beneath the stands, and water to keep in the shallow trough. Each task had a natural stopping place. Once the work was complete, nothing demanded that he invent more. Bertram began carrying a small notebook in the pocket where he had once kept lists of boys requiring attention. Its cover was plain brown board, softened at the corners by previous use. He had intended it for household expenses during his stay, but the first pages remained almost empty. Selworthy offered few opportunities for spending money. One morning, Agnes mentioned that the orange pollen entering Brook probably came from hawkweed on the drier slope. Bertram wrote the observation down before he could forget it. Beneath it, he added the direction of the wind and the time shown on his watch. The next day, he recorded that bees from orchard returned rapidly before a shower, while old Meg's workers continued flying until the first drops struck the roof. He noted the difference, without knowing whether it was important. Soon the notebook accompanied him every morning. He wrote while seated on the three-legged stool, balancing the book upon one knee. His early entries were brief and orderly: willow pollen, pale gold. Early flights after sun reaches shelter. Brook requires further observation. Stores improving. New colony drawing comb on 4 frames. Young bees fly facing the entrance before widening their circles. Agnes pretended not to notice the notebook until Bertram attempted to write a rule about rain. Bees return before rain, he murmured as his pencil moved. Sometimes, he looked up. Agnes was fitting a strip of wax foundation into a clean frame. Sometimes, they return because the rain is coming. Sometimes, because the flowers have closed. Sometimes, because the wind has turned. And sometimes, half of them remain out and prove you wrong. Bertram placed the word sometimes at the beginning of the sentence. After that correction, his entries grew less certain and more useful. He learned to distinguish what he had witnessed from what he had assumed. When Agnes offered several possible explanations, he recorded all of them. Where the evidence was incomplete, he left a blank space rather than forcing a conclusion. The habit changed the way he listened to her. Previously, he had remembered the instruction and forgotten the circumstances. Now, he asked what the weather had been, which colony she had observed, and whether the same sign had ever meant something different. Agnes answered while working, often beginning with the phrase, "It depends." Bertram had once discouraged those words in the classroom. A question, properly framed, ought to possess an answer. Yet the bees existed among too many changing conditions for certainty to be so easily obtained. Temperature, wind, blossom, age of the queen, strength of the colony, and the preceding winter could alter the meaning of what appeared at the entrance. The notebook did not become less orderly. Its order simply made room for doubt. Agnes's knowledge revealed itself in fragments. She could estimate the stores in a hive by lifting one side from its stand. She knew by smell when nectar from bramble had begun to thicken into honey. She recognized the higher, unsettled note of a colony missing its queen, and the deeper contentment of bees working steadily in warm weather. None of these understandings stood alone. Each depended upon another sign. Bertram tried to arrange the fragments under headings. Agnes regarded the headings with mild suspicion, but permitted them. She corrected his descriptions when they grew too elegant. If he wrote that a healthy colony possessed a harmonious voice, she replaced harmonious with even. Bees, she said, did not require poetry to be understood. As summer settled over the Coombe, Bertram's room at Mrs. Coombe's house changed as well. The physician's letter disappeared into a drawer. A second pair of muddy boots stood near the kitchen range. On the writing table, the notebook lay beside several loose pages on which he copied his crowded morning entries in a clearer hand. He slept more regularly. On waking, he no longer asked whether he had rested for the approved number of hours. He looked instead at the light beyond the curtains and wondered which flowers would open in it. The long spell of fair weather ended with rain from the west. Clouds settled low over Selworthy Beacon, and water flowed down the lane in narrow silver streams. The bees remained within their hives, their sound enclosed beneath the shelter. Bertram went to the apiary despite the weather. Agnes was in a small room behind her kitchen, repairing frames and sorting pieces of old comb. The room smelled of wax, damp wool, and the tea warming beside the stove. Rain tapped against the single window. She gave Bertram a cloth and showed him how to clean resin from the frame lugs. They worked on opposite sides of the table. With the bees confined by rain, the morning possessed a quieter rhythm, and conversation entered the spaces usually occupied by flight. Bertram asked who had taught her to judge a colony by sound. "My grandmother first," Agnes said. "The woman old Meg is named for. Her grandmother had lost much of her sight in later years, but she continued visiting the hives with one hand resting on Agnes's shoulder. She taught the child to listen before allowing her to lift a cover. Agnes's mother had understood flowers better than sound. She knew which hedges would feed bees after a dry spring, and which meadow plants failed when the ground remained wet. An unmarried aunt recognized trouble by smell and could detect souring stores before anyone else noticed them. Bertram paused in his cleaning. The knowledge he had attributed to one woman was already the work of several lives. Agnes had learned by following each of them. No one had announced a formal lesson. As a girl, she carried tools, fetched water, held baskets, and listened to remarks made while other work continued. By the time someone asked what she knew, the answer had entered her hands so thoroughly that she could no longer remember learning it. Bertram turned to a clean page and wrote the names as Agnes supplied them. Margaret Tarr, her grandmother; Eliza Tarr, her mother; Ruth Bell, her mother's sister. Beside each name he recorded the form of attention that woman had practiced. Agnes watched the pencil for a moment, then resumed scraping wax. Her husband had learned some of the work after their marriage, though the sea remained his true occupation. He worked from the coast beyond the hills, leaving before daylight when the weather allowed. 30 years earlier, his boat had failed to return after a change of wind. Agnes described this without detail. The loss had belonged to many winters and no longer needed to be opened whenever it was mentioned. They had expected children but had none. The statement was as plain as the others, yet Bertram understood its place in the conversation. The apiary had passed from one generation of women to another. With Agnes, that line would end. Outside, rain thickened against the glass. Bertram did not tell her that knowledge survived through books, for he knew books could preserve words while losing the understanding behind them. Nor did he promise that he could replace the person who had never arrived to inherit the work. He cleaned the remaining frame, set it beside the others, and closed his notebook. "May I write it properly?" he asked. Agnes looked at the book. "You have been writing it for weeks. I have been writing for myself. I mean a record another keeper might use." She poured the tea before answering. Steam rose between them, carrying the scent of mint leaves. Agnes said a written record would be useful, only if it did not persuade the reader that every hive behaved alike. Bertram promised to include the exceptions. "Include what you are uncertain of as well," she said. "A blank is safer than a false answer." He opened the notebook again. From that rainy morning, the work acquired a second form. At the apiary, Bertram observed and assisted. In the evenings, he copied Agnes's knowledge onto larger sheets, arranging it by season rather than alphabet. He left broad margins for additions and empty lines wherever experience had not yet supplied an answer. Agnes read the pages slowly on wet days. She changed precise commands into gentler cautions. Always became usually, never became rarely. A sentence about the sound of a queenless colony was followed by 3 other signs that should be present before the hive was disturbed. The resulting record belonged wholly to neither of them. The knowledge came through Agnes from women Bertram had never met. The structure came from habits formed during his years of teaching. Even the blank spaces had a purpose, preserving room for observations made in seasons still to come. On the first page, Bertram wrote a title in his careful schoolmaster's hand. Beneath it, he drew a straight line where an author's name would ordinarily appear. He considered writing Agnes Tarr. He considered leaving the space for several names. In the end, he left the line empty. Outside the open window, bees moved between the clover and the apiary in long, invisible paths. Their work could be traced in the changing weight of the hives, though no single bee could have claimed the honey as its own. By the time the first fields below Selworthy turned from green to a muted gold, the village had ceased to regard Bertram as a temporary visitor. No one had asked how long he intended to remain. His place had been established through smaller recognitions. Mrs. Coombe no longer explained which lane led to the church. The postman included him when speaking of tomorrow's weather, and people passing the apiary lifted a hand to him before continuing uphill. The bees were partly responsible. Bertram had learned which household belonged to many of the named hives. Orchard was kept for the family tending the lower apple ground. Brook belonged to a widow whose garden ran beside the stream. 2 colonies near the end of the shelter were shared by farming families on the open slopes, while one of Agnes's smaller hives supplied wax for candles used in the church. The arrangement existed without contracts. Agnes cared for the colonies and made the principal decisions. In return, the owners provided what the apiary required. One family repaired hive roofs, another brought straw. Someone with a horse lent a cart when colonies had to be moved. Honey was divided only after enough had been left for the bees. Bertram added these details to his larger record, but Agnes would not allow him to assign exact values to every exchange. A repaired roof may last 7 years, she said. A jar of honey may last 7 mornings. That does not make one debt larger than the other. The approach of Lammas brought more activity to the lane. Carts carried flour, early apples, folded trestle tables, and bundles of greenery towards the open ground near the church. The fields were not yet fully harvested, but the first sheaves stood drying, and their color warmed the village after weeks of summer rain. Isaac Pruitt arrived at Agnes's gate with a handcart filled with empty jars packed in straw. He traveled between the scattered villages of the estate, selling tea, lamp oil, soap, needles, and whatever else could be carried over the Exmoor roads. Throughout the year, he collected sound jars for Agnes, accepting a small allowance of honey after the harvest. Bertram helped unload them. The jars differed in height and shape. Some carried faint lettering from preserves they had once contained. Others bore tiny bubbles in the glass. Agnes examined every rim for chips before washing the jars in hot water and setting them upside down on clean cloths. Several shelves in the honey room already held candles and blocks of pale wax prepared for the Lammas table. Agnes made no attempt to turn the display into a shop. Some items would be sold, some exchanged, and some quietly carried home by people who could offer nothing that season. During an interval, Bertram noticed that Agnes had placed no price beside 3 jars. One was intended for a shepherd recovering from fever, another for a mother whose infant had been coughing, and the third for Mrs. Coombe, who supplied cloth whenever the honey room was used. Agnes mentioned these destinations as casually as she named the hives. Nothing was described as charity or payment. Each jar simply had its place. Bertram added no note to his ledger, understanding that this distribution was part of the apiary's order even if it could not be balanced in columns. On the morning of the gathering, Bertram and Agnes loaded 2 wooden crates onto a barrow. The path to the church descended between cottage gardens bright with late roses and tall hollyhocks. The warm air smelled of cut grass, bread, and the smoke of outdoor cooking fires. Bertram had expected to feel conspicuous among the villagers. Instead, he was occupied with keeping the barrow steady over the stones. By the time they reached the green, several people were already calling Agnes towards the tables, and he found himself following with the crates as naturally as if he had done so before. The apiary's table stood beneath a canvas awning. Bertram arranged the wax candles by height and placed the honey jars where sunlight would not warm them. Agnes moved through the crowd, answering questions about bees in chimneys, wasps near a pantry window, and an apple tree that had flowered without setting much fruit. People also asked about the swarm beneath the old apple tree. A child had watched part of its capture from the lane, and the story had grown slightly in the telling. According to one version, Bertram had stood inside a black cloud of bees without moving. According to another, the swarm had covered his hat. Bertram denied both accounts. The children appeared disappointed until Agnes told them he had held the branch correctly on his first attempt. Coming from her, this modest fact seemed to restore his reputation. Near the church wall, the vicar had arranged a board showing the plants that fed village bees through the year. Several children were meant to copy labels beneath pressed samples, but their writing had become crowded and uncertain. He asked whether Mr. Locke might help them. The request tightened something in Bertram's chest. 6 children stood around the board, each holding a chalk pencil or strip of paper. Their overlapping voices recalled 100 mornings in Bristol, desks opening, boots scraping, questions arriving, before he had finished answering the last. For a moment, he considered saying that his physician had forbidden professional responsibility. Then he looked at the pressed flowers. There was willow, apple blossom, hawthorn, clover, bramble, and a dried sprig of heather waiting for its season. He asked the children to arrange them in the order the bees would find them. The voices did not become quiet, but they gained a direction. One child remembered yellow pollen at the beginning of spring. Another had seen bees in the apple orchard. A girl whose family owned Brook Hive recognized bramble from the hedge beside her house. Bertram guided their hands without correcting every uneven letter. There was no bell to end the lesson. When the final label had been placed beneath the heather, the children ran towards the bread table. Bertram remained beside the board, surprised by the absence of fatigue. He understood then that teaching itself had not emptied him. What had exhausted him was the belief that he must remain responsible for every hour, every result, and every person placed under his care. Here he had offered one small piece of order, and then allowed the children to leave, carrying whatever they remembered. The Lammas gathering continued through the afternoon. Bread was blessed and shared. Early fruit, preserves, and garden produce passed from one household to another. Before Agnes packed the remaining candles, the vicar set aside 2 honey jars for villagers confined to their homes. Bertram pushed the lighter barrow back up the lane. He and Agnes spoke little during the climb. Below them, voices and dishes gradually faded, while bees moved among the flowers growing over the churchyard wall. The first honey harvest began several mornings later. Agnes chose only frames whose cells were fully sealed with wax. The clover and bramble flow had provided more than the colonies needed for their present strength, but she tested the weight of every hive before deciding how much could be taken. Bertram helped carry the selected frames into the honey room. Each was covered with a clean cloth to keep bees from following the scent. The room had thick walls and one north-facing window. Sunlight entered without heating the honey, falling across a stone table, scrubbed pale through years of use. Agnes heated a long, uncapping knife in a jug of water. With slow strokes, she removed the thin wax seals from each side of a frame. The cappings curled away like translucent shavings, releasing the scent of warm grass and flowers. Bertram tried the next frame. His first cut went too deeply and removed part of the comb. Agnes returned the loosened wax to a bowl and showed him how the blade should rest against the wooden edges. "The bees have already measured it," she said. "Follow their measure." His second cut was cleaner. The opened frames were placed inside an old hand-turned extractor. Bertram began rotating the handle with the brisk rhythm he might once have used to sharpen pencils for an examination room. The machine shook against the floor. Agnes placed one hand upon it. "The honey has waited this long." He slowed. The extractor settled into a quiet turning, and honey began striking its metal sides in a soft, steady rain. When the first frames were emptied, they reversed them and repeated the process. At the bottom of the drum, the honey gathered in a pool of pale amber. Agnes opened the tap, and a thick stream passed through clean cloth into a stoneware vessel. Small pieces of wax remained behind, while the clear honey folded slowly upon itself. They worked through the morning without haste. The uncapping knife returned to the warm water. Frames entered and left the extractor. The vessel filled. On a tray near the stove, washed jars were warmed so the glass would not chill the honey as it was poured. Bertram filled the first jar under Agnes's direction. He stopped too late, and honey rose close to the rim. On the second, he stopped too early. By the fourth, the level sat evenly beneath the neck. Agnes wiped every rim before placing a paper cover and lid upon it. Her old labels contained only a source and a season: orchard blossom, lower meadow clover, bramble, mixed garden. They identified where the honey had come from, but little of the year that produced it. Bertram tasted a trace remaining on the ladle. The flavor was light at first, then warmer, with something green beneath the sweetness. He looked at the row of jars and thought of wet weeks, brief, clear mornings, the crowded bramble hedges, and bees returning before rain. "Could the labels say more?" he asked. Agnes glanced at the narrow slips of paper. "The honey already says what it is. Only to someone who knows how to listen to honey." This earned him the smallest suggestion of a smile. On a fresh label, Bertram wrote, "Clover and bramble, pale gold, after the long summer rains." Agnes read it twice. She objected that the rain had not been long everywhere, only along the western side of the combe. He amended the line accordingly. They continued with each batch. Honey from the lower orchard was clearer and carried a faint remnant of spring blossom. The new colony's small surplus was left untouched. It had too much building still to do before winter. The labels became another form of the notebook. They recorded not instructions, but the character of a particular season, where the bees had flown, what had flowered, how the weather had moved across the hills, and what the colonies could spare. Late in the afternoon, The final jar was sealed. Bertram's sleeves were marked with wax, and the floor smelled of honey despite repeated wiping. Agnes placed the labeled jars along the shelves, grouping them by source. Sunlight entered through the north window at a low angle and passed through the glass. The stone table and whitewashed wall filled with rectangles of gold, amber, and pale brown. For a few minutes, the room seemed to hold the color of every warm day the bees had gathered. Bertram stood beside Agnes in the quiet honey room. Neither spoke. Outside, beyond the thick wall, the colonies continued their evening flights towards flowers that had not yet finished blooming. After the first honey had been stored, the flowers of the lower combe began to diminish. Clover heads browned in the meadows. The bramble petals fell, and the orchard settled into the heavier green of late summer. The bees still found forage in cottage gardens and along the damp edges of the stream, but their returning loads grew smaller. Above the village, another season was beginning. At first the heather showed only as a faint purple cast across the open ground. Then color gathered along the slopes until the high land appeared covered by a deep, muted cloth. On clear afternoons, the change could be seen from Mrs. Coombe's upper window. Bertram watched the purple spread while copying the final notes from the clover harvest. Agnes had long taken several colonies to the higher ground when the heather flowered. The journey was short in distance but steep, and not every hive was strong enough to benefit. A weak colony could spend more energy adjusting to the move than it gained from the new forage. Together they examined the entrances and lifted the rear of each hive to judge its weight. Agnes selected bramble, lower wall, and 2 unnamed colonies belonging to families with grazing land above the village. Old Meg remained beneath the shelter. After producing the swarm and raising a new queen, it needed time to settle. The captured colony also stayed in the orchard, still building the stores upon which its first winter would depend. Bertram wrote the reasons beside every choice. Agnes corrected him when he described the colonies left behind as unsuitable. Unsuitable for the heather, she said, not unsuitable altogether. He amended the phrase. The distinction seemed characteristic of everything he had learned from her. A judgment without its circumstances could easily become an injustice. The hives had to be moved after the foragers returned. During the afternoon, a farmer left a low cart and patient grey pony at Agnes's gate. Bertram inspected the leather straps twice, tested the wheels, and arranged blocks of wood so the hives would remain level. Agnes watched these preparations without interfering. His carefulness no longer possessed the anxious sharpness it had carried in spring. He was not attempting to command the evening. He was making ready for it. As the light softened, the outward flight slowed. Workers arrived in decreasing numbers, dropping heavily onto the landing boards after their final journeys. Agnes waited until the last visible bees had entered before reducing each doorway with a strip of wire screen. Air could pass through, but the colonies would remain enclosed during the climb. The hives were lifted onto the cart one at a time. Bertram took the heavier side, while Agnes guided each base into position. The work demanded care rather than speed. A sudden tilt might dislodge frames or crush bees between them. By the 4th hive, Bertram felt a familiar weakness enter his arms. His shoulders tightened, and a fine trembling began beneath one sleeve. He recognized the signs before Agnes spoke. In Bristol, he would have continued. He would have hidden the trembling, completed the loading, and paid for the appearance of strength with a sleepless night. Even now, the old impulse told him that asking an older woman to wait would be shameful. Bertram set down his end of the carrying board. "I must rest before the climb," he said. Agnes lowered her side without surprise. "Then we shall rest before the climb." They sat on the orchard wall while evening collected beneath the trees. The pony cropped grass near the gate. From inside the screened hives came 4 separate murmurs, each deepened by confinement, but not alarmed. Agnes neither praised Bertram for stopping, nor asked whether he could continue. Her lack of concern allowed the pause to remain an ordinary part of the work, rather than evidence of failure. When the trembling had passed, they drank water and began again. Bertram found that the unhurried rest had preserved more time than forcing himself onward would have done. The cart left the apiary as the first lamps appeared in the cottages. Agnes walked beside the pony, holding the rein. Bertram followed near the rear wheel, listening for any change in the hives. The route climbed beyond the last garden, through a gate, and onto a track bordered by fern and gorse. Below them, Selworthy gathered into a few pale roofs among dark trees. Smoke rose from evening fires and flattened briefly in the cooler air. Farther west, beyond the folds of land, a narrow brightness remained above the Bristol Channel. They stopped twice to check the straps. Each time, Bertram placed his hand against the hive walls. The bee's vibration traveled through wood into his palm. The colonies were disturbed by the movement, but their sound remained even. Near the upper ground, an old stone wall curved around a sheltered hollow. Agnes had prepared 4 stands there earlier in the week. The wall broke the western wind, while the open slope beyond gave the bees immediate access to heather. They unloaded the hives in the fading light. Agnes kept the entrances screened until every box stood level and still. Then she opened them one by one. A few bees emerged, walked across the boards, and returned inside. Full orientation flights would begin with the next morning's light. The work was finished before darkness covered the track. Bertram sat upon the stone wall, tired but not emptied. His body had reached its limit, announced it, and been obeyed. Nothing had been lost through that obedience. The hives stood where they belonged. Agnes sat beside him. The village below appeared smaller than the school grounds he had once crossed, several times each day. Yet he felt no wish to measure the distance he had travelled from Bristol. "I used to think rest came after the work," he said. "Sometimes it comes in the middle." They remained until the bees' sound blended with wind moving through the heather. During the following weeks, Bertram visited the upper hives with Agnes every few days. They went after breakfast, carrying water, the smoker, and his notebook in a canvas bag. The walk became easier when he accepted that it need not be completed without stopping. The upper apiary developed its own routine. On each visit, Agnes first stood below the wall and watched the entrances before approaching. Bertram placed their bag on the flat stone, checked that the stands had not shifted after rain, and filled a water dish from the bottle they carried. Only then did they decide whether any cover needed lifting. Most mornings, the answer was no. From that height, the bees' journeys could be imagined across a wider country. Some vanished over the shoulder of the hill, while others descended towards sheltered patches invisible from the track. Bertram began sketching lines in his notebook, not as fixed routes, but as possibilities suggested by the direction of returning flights. Agnes warned him that wind could bend a bee's path and make a nearby flower appear distant. He added that caution in the margin. They sometimes met villagers, cutting fern or tending sheep, and each person slowed to ask how the colonies were taking to the heather. Bertram noticed that the question was never merely about honey. A successful late flow meant stronger winter stores, candles for the church, jars for households, and proof that the season had offered enough. The hives on the hill belonged to 4 owners, yet their welfare traveled through the whole village in ways no ownership list could contain. Heather bees returned with pollen of a dull grey-brown, and nectar that would produce darker, thicker honey than the summer harvest. Their flights remained low over the purple plants. On windy days, they worked in the lee of the wall. After rain, the whole slope released a clean, earthy scent. Bertram's notebook grew crowded with observations. He recorded which colonies began flying first, how the wall altered the wind, and the difference between the sound of a hive being moved and the sound of one lacking a queen. He compared these notes with Agnes's memories of former heather seasons. In the evenings, he copied the material into the larger record. He preserved Agnes's plain expressions whenever his own phrasing threatened to make them abstract. Listen before opening remained listen before opening. Leave enough for the bees was not replaced by any calculation pretending to apply to every colony. He began to understand that the strength of the record lay partly in its refusal to make beekeeping appear simpler than it was. Its pages offered ways of noticing, not a method for avoiding attention. One evening, after copying a section about moving hives, Bertram turned to the back of his private notebook. There he wrote a sentence not intended for the apiary record. I came to Selworthy to recover by doing nothing. He considered the words, then continued. What I found was not idleness, but work that possesses an end to each day and a season for each duty. My hands and thoughts are occupied, but they are no longer required to quarrel with my body. He closed the book without revising the passage. Rain kept them indoors the next morning. Bertram carried the clean pages to Agnes's workroom, where she was sorting empty honey jars by size. Until then, she had read only separate sections. He now placed the gathered record before her. Agnes wiped her hands and sat beside the window. She read slowly, turning back whenever one instruction referred to an earlier page. Bertram tried to busy himself with the jars, but he remained aware of every pause. She corrected the spelling of a field name and crossed out his description of a hive's angry sound. Bees could be unsettled, defensive, sharp, or frightened, she said, but anger was a human explanation placed too easily upon them. At the section concerning a queenless colony, Agnes read his description twice. Bertram had included not only the higher note at the entrance, but also the absence of eggs, the disorder of the workers, and the need to confirm several signs before acting. Agnes rested one finger beneath the final line. You have written what I know, she said, but had never known how to say. The words did not make Bertram feel that his work was complete. They made him aware that it had become useful to someone besides himself. Agnes turned back to the beginning. She asked whether the section on spring feeding should come before the first inspection, and whether the notes on sound might be grouped together rather than scattered through the seasons. For the first time, she was not merely correcting his record, she was considering its shape with him. They spent the rainy morning moving pages across the table. Bertram supplied order. Agnes tested that order against experience. Neither could have produced the same book alone. When fair weather returned, they climbed again to the upper hives. The heather was at its fullest, purple beneath a washed blue sky. Bees crossed the slope in steady lines, and the air above the plants held their low, continuous music. Bertram sat on the stone wall and opened his notebook. There remained half a page beneath the morning's entry. Once he would have felt compelled to fill it before returning home. Instead, he laid the pencil between the leaves and closed the cover. Agnes sat nearby, watching the flights along the sheltered side of the wall. For a while, there was nothing more either of them needed to record. The afternoon itself was clear enough. The heather faded slowly. Purple remained in sheltered hollows after the exposed slopes had begun to brown, and the bees continued working whenever sunlight warmed the upper ground. Their flights shortened with each passing week. By late afternoon, the air above the stone wall grew empty long before the village lamps appeared below. Agnes decided that the 4 colonies had gathered what the season would provide. They returned with the same cart that had carried the hives uphill, waiting until the foragers were home before screening the entrances. This time, Bertram required no reminder to check the air holes, steady the boxes with wooden blocks, or test the leather straps. He also sat down before the lifting began. Agnes joined him on the wall, and they drank water while the pony waited beside the track. The rest was not forced upon him by weakness. It was included in the work from the beginning. The descent took place beneath a clear evening sky. Bertram walked beside the rear wheel, one hand occasionally resting against the nearest hive. The colonies murmured through the movement. Below, smoke rose vertically from Selworthy's chimneys, and the pale cottages gathered among trees whose first leaves had turned copper. When the cart entered the orchard, the bees from the lower apiary were already quiet. The travelling hives were returned to their former stands one by one. Agnes opened the screens after each box had settled. No bees rushed out. The smell of home, wax, wood, fallen apples, and the neighbouring colonies appeared to quiet them. By the following morning, the 4 hives had resumed ordinary flights. A few workers performed new orientation circles, adjusting their memory from open heath to orchard shelter. Bertram watched them from the 3-legged stool and entered the return in his notebook. The heather harvest began only after Agnes had assessed every colony. The upper hives had gained considerable weight, yet autumn lay ahead and winter beyond it. She chose fewer frames than Bertram expected. He lifted one hive again, feeling the heaviness of its stores. "There is more than we are taking. There should be," Agnes said. She reminded him that surplus could be judged only in relation to what the bees would need when no flowers remained. A generous harvest for the keeper could become a hunger inside the hive months later. The first claim upon honey belonged to the colony that had made it. Bertram crossed out the number he had estimated and wrote Agnes's sentence instead. In the honey room, the final harvest followed the same motions as the first, but Bertram no longer required instruction at every stage. He heated the uncapping knife, wiped the stone table, and positioned the extractor before Agnes carried in the first covered frames. He turned the handle slowly from the beginning. Heather honey resisted the comb more than the pale summer honey had done. It was darker, thicker, and reluctant to leave the cells. Agnes loosened it carefully before the frames were placed in the extractor. When it finally reached the vessel, it folded in a deep amber stream that seemed to contain the color of the moor after rain. Bertram tasted a trace from the wooden spoon. The flavor was less immediately sweet than the clover honey. It carried something warm, earthy, and faintly bitter beneath the richness. Agnes watched him consider it. The high ground does not make mild honey. They filled the jars together. Bertram held each one beneath the tap, stopping at the correct level. Agnes wiped the rims and sealed them. Their movements had become sufficiently familiar that silence no longer indicated uncertainty. Each knew what the other would do next. For the label, Bertram first wrote only Heather, Upper Combe. Agnes placed beside him the notebook containing their observations of western winds, the sheltered wall, and the final weeks of purple bloom. He added a second line, dark amber, gathered after the long west winds. Neither name appeared upon it. The label belonged to the flowers, the place, the weather, and the bees. They repeated it until the jars stood in an ordered row beside the paler honey gathered earlier in the year. The difference between the harvests was visible through the glass. Apple blossom held the light almost clearly. Clover and bramble carried a soft gold. Heather darkened towards brown. Together the jars seemed to record the changing color of the season. Before the jars were put away, Agnes divided the harvest according to the colonies that had produced it. The 4 households whose hives had traveled to the upper ground received their shares first. Several jars were set aside for the church, 2 for families visited by the district nurse, and 1 for the farmer who had lent the pony and cart. Bertram wrote the destinations on a loose sheet, but Agnes asked him not to place them in the beekeeping record. The book should teach care of bees, she said, while the giving of honey belonged to the people of each season. Their needs would change, and no list written now should instruct kindness years later. Bertram folded the sheet into the household ledger, where it could serve the present without pretending to govern the future. Once the honey room had been cleaned, the work of preparing for winter began. It lacked the brightness of blossom or the excitement of a swarm, yet Agnes approached it with greater care than any harvest. Honey could be enjoyed only because colonies survived to gather again. They inspected roofs for leaks and stands for softness after rain. Bertram replaced a rusted hinge on brook and sealed a narrow crack in bramble. Agnes reduced the entrances so mice could not easily enter when the nights grew cold. Beneath the shelter, they cleared fallen leaves that might hold damp against the wood. The straw skeps were brushed and returned to the upper shelf. Veils were washed, dried, and folded. The smoker was emptied of ash, its bellows oiled before storage. Wax scraps were sorted into those clean enough for candles and those useful only for starting future smokers. For hives exposed to the western wind, they prepared straw wrapping, held by lengths of cord. Agnes showed Bertram how to leave ventilation above the cluster. Warmth without moving air could create damp, and damp harmed bees more quietly than cold. The captured swarm required special attention. It had built comb and raised young through summer, but its stores remained lighter than those of established colonies. Agnes gave it sealed honey frames taken from stronger hives, choosing only what the donors could spare. Bertram asked whether that meant the new colony had failed to provide for itself. "It began with nothing," Agnes replied. "Reaching autumn alive is not failure." He entered the sentence in the margin beside his earlier note about increase through repeated work. Through the following weeks, he became attentive to the smaller signs of the year closing. Spiders built webs inside the empty corners of the shelter. Wasps searched the landing boards for unguarded sweetness, and the reduced entrances allowed the bees to defend themselves more easily. Morning mist stayed between the orchard trees until nearly noon. Fallen apples softened beneath the grass, carrying a fermented scent that mingled with wood smoke. On clear days, the bees still emerged briefly, their flights low and purposeful. Bertram no longer expected each warm hour to reverse the season. He understood that these journeys were exceptions within the general quieting, small opportunities accepted without mistaking them for the return of summer. Even old Meg's voice had lowered, drawing inward with the shortening light. As the apiary quieted, the written record grew. Bertram arranged the clean pages according to the bees' year rather than the human calendar. The opening section concerned listening at the end of winter. Then came first flights, spring inspection, swarming, the summer flow, harvest, heather, and preparation for cold weather. Agnes insisted that the section on harvesting be followed immediately by the section on leaving sufficient stores. She did not want a reader to learn how to take honey without being reminded where ownership began. Bertram copied the names of Margaret Tarr, Eliza Tarr, and Ruth Bell into the margins beside the observations each woman had passed down. The blank line beneath the title remained. The record still had no single author. The evenings drew inward. Mrs. Coombe began lighting the parlour lamp before supper, and a fire burned regularly in the grate. Bertram's boots returned from the apiary, carrying fallen leaves rather than summer dust. His coat smelled faintly of smoke and wax. One evening, Mrs. Coombe found him at the dining table, cutting labels for the remaining jars. She placed a dish of baked apples between them and asked when he intended to return to Bristol. The question surprised him because he had once known the answer. His original account with her had covered only a few weeks. Afterwards, he had extended it through the apple blossom, then through the clover season. Each decision had been temporary, attached to the next piece of work. He thought of the crates in his sister's attic, his closed room in Bristol, and the watch that now sometimes remained unwound for days. Nothing there required his immediate return. In Selworthy, the bees would soon become quiet, yet winter did not feel like an ending. There were pages to complete, frames to repair, wax to prepare, and sounds beneath the hives that could be understood only by listening through the cold. "If the room is available," he said, "I should like to keep it through the winter." Mrs. Coombe served the apples. I had not offered it to anyone else. That was the full extent of the arrangement. Bertram did not announce that Selworthy had become his home. He paid the next portion of his account and asked whether a cupboard near the kitchen might hold his apiary clothing. The following morning, Agnes found him repairing a wooden entrance block in the workroom. She had heard of his decision, though Bertram did not ask how quickly news had travelled from Mrs. Coombe's dining table. Agnes brought in the three-legged stool. One of its repaired legs had loosened again after the summer's use. Together they removed the old nail, fitted a small wedge of ash wood, and tightened the joint until the stool stood evenly. While Bertram cleaned the tools, Agnes turned the seat over. With the point of a narrow knife, she scratched two small letters into the underside, B.L. The mark would not be visible when the stool stood upright. She made no explanation. Bertram offered none in return. They carried the stool back beneath the shelter and placed it beside old Meg. The hive entrances were smaller now, and fewer bees crossed the cool air. Bertram sat while Agnes listened along the row. Soon he joined her, placing one hand against each wall before bending near. At the end of the morning, they returned their equipment to the workroom. Bertram hung his veil and outer coat beside Agnes's. Their gloves rested together upon the shelf, and the smoker stood below them, cleaned and waiting. Nothing in the arrangement had been ceremonially given. Still, when Agnes closed the workroom door, two sets of clothing remained inside, prepared for whatever the next season required. The first hard frost whitened Selworthy during the night. It silvered the lane, stiffened the grass beneath the orchard trees, and traced the edges of every fallen leaf. When Bertram opened his curtains, the roofs below appeared paler than usual, their thatch holding a thin brightness beneath the early sky. The bees did not fly that morning. Their entrances remained dark and still, reduced to narrow openings beneath the winter coverings. A person passing the apiary might have believed the boxes empty. Bertram knew better, though he resisted the temptation to disturb them merely for reassurance. There was still work to finish away from the hives. The last honey shares waited in Agnes's pantry, arranged according to the loose household sheet. Over several quiet afternoons, she and Bertram carried the jars through the village. Apple blossom honey went to the family tending the lower orchard. Clover and bramble reached the cottages near the stream and meadow. The darker heather jars were divided among the owners of the colonies that had travelled uphill. Other jars went to the church, to Mrs. Coombe, and to households where illness had made the coming winter more difficult. No delivery required a speech. A jar was placed upon a kitchen table, accepted with a few words, and added to the preserves and dry goods prepared for cold weather. Yet each visit revealed how far the apiary extended beyond Agnes's garden. Its work continued in cups of warm water, bread spread with honey, candles lit beside evening chairs, and wax used to quiet a stubborn drawer or strengthen sewing thread. Bertram added none of these uses to the formal record. Agnes had been right. Kindness could not be governed by an old list. Still, he remembered them. The hives had gathered from land belonging to no single household, and their harvest travelled back through the village in the same manner. In the honey room, the remaining jars were placed in seasonal order. The pale spring honey stood first, followed by summer gold and the dark amber from the upper comb. Even after the shares had been distributed, enough remained to show the movement of the year through color. Bertram read the labels from left to right. Apple blossom after cold mornings. Clover and bramble following rain along the western side. Heather gathered after long winds. Each phrase recalled more than taste. He remembered the veil waiting on his stool, old Meg opening beneath Agnes's hands, the swarm settling on white cloth, and the cart climbing while evening gathered below. Nothing in those memories had seemed important enough to divide his life when it occurred. Their meaning had accumulated like honey, one small journey at a time. The written record was nearly complete. Bertram had copied the final pages in his clearest hand and bound them between two boards covered with green cloth. Agnes contributed a piece of linen thread strong enough to hold the gatherings of paper. On the cover, he wrote only, "The Tarr Apiary." They reviewed the book beside the stove in Agnes's workroom. The pages began with the winter cluster and the practice of listening before opening. They moved through first flights, blossom, inspection, swarming, summer forage, harvest, the heather journey, and winter preparation. At the end, Bertram had left several blank pages. Agnes turned them slowly. "Have you forgotten something?" "Certainly," he said. "I do not yet know what it is." The blank pages were kept. At the front of the book, the line intended for an author's name still waited beneath the title. Bertram set his pen beside Agnes and asked her to write her name. She refused. The knowledge had begun before her and would, she now hoped, continue after her. Bertram suggested listing Margaret Tarr, Eliza Tarr, Ruth Bell, and Agnes. She pointed out that his ordering, comparisons, and questions had altered the book as surely as her memories had filled it. Neither was willing to place one name above the others. At last, Bertram removed the empty line by pasting a clean strip of paper across it. Upon the strip, they wrote together, "Notes from the Tarr Apiary, recorded at Selworthy Combe." Beneath it, Agnes added a shorter sentence, "For whoever comes next." The handwriting changed halfway through the page, Bertram's narrow letters giving way to Agnes's firmer strokes. He looked at the two lines and thought they described the work more truthfully than any list of authors could have done. The book was placed on the shelf above the old household ledger. It stood between a jar of pencils and a wooden box containing labels from previous harvests. Nothing marked it as an object of ceremony. It belonged among the tools. Winter altered Bertram's days without emptying them. He helped Agnes melt clean wax for candles, repaired frames, and copied a second set of pages in case damp ever reached the original book. In the afternoons, he walked through the village or read beside Mrs. Coombe's parlour fire. The hours were quieter than those of summer, but they no longer felt vacant. He wrote to his sister in Bristol and asked her to keep the crates in her attic until spring. He did not describe Selworthy as a cure, nor claim that his health had been restored. Some nights remained wakeful. Busy rooms could still leave him tired, and he knew that carrying too much would bring back the trembling. What had changed was his response. He no longer treated these limits as failures requiring punishment. In his letter, he wrote about the bees gathered within their winter clusters and about the record standing in Agnes's workroom. He explained that he intended to remain until the first flights returned. When he finished, he noticed that the phrase sounded temporary, as each earlier extension had sounded temporary. This time, however, it contained no wish to escape either place. Spring was simply the next season whose work he wanted to understand. As the weather cooled, Bertram continued visiting the apiary each morning. Some days a brief interval of sun brought a few bees outside. They made low cleansing flights close to the shelter and returned quickly. On other days, frost remained in the shade until afternoon, and no movement appeared at the entrances. He learned not to demand visible proof from every hive. A hand against the wall, an ear near the boards, and the weight of stored honey offered enough information. Even then, Agnes sometimes told him to leave a colony entirely undisturbed. Knowing how to listen included knowing when not to ask for an answer. The captured swarm entered winter with sufficient stores. It had not produced honey for the village, and it still possessed no formal name, but Agnes no longer referred to it as new. Its bees had built comb, raised young, and prepared a cluster of their own. The colony had survived long enough for its beginning to cease being its most important characteristic. One afternoon, Agnes carried the three-legged stool into her kitchen. She rubbed a little beeswax into the dry seat and polished the wood with a cloth. The initials beneath it remained hidden unless the stool was turned over. When Bertram arrived, she pushed it towards him. "It has stopped being my basket stand," she said. Bertram rested one hand on the worn seat. "Has it? Your place should not have to be cleared every morning." He understood that this was as close as Agnes would come to formally giving it. The stool had been offered gradually, first for a weak moment, then for daily observation, and finally as a place that no longer needed explanation. Together, they carried it back to the shelter. Bertram set it beside old Meg, where the ground was firm and the roof protected it from rain. Agnes placed her own upturned box a short distance away. Snow came during the night several days later. It was not deep enough to close the lanes, but it softened every edge of the village. The hedges carried white along their upper branches, and the orchard trees stood dark against the pale ground. Smoke rose slowly from the chimneys because there was almost no wind. Bertram woke before Mrs. Coombe lit the stove. The old habit no longer troubled him. He dressed quietly, put on his coat, and walked uphill through the new snow. His boots made the first marks along the orchard path. At Agnes's gate, he found another set of prints coming from the cottage. She was already beneath the shelter, carrying the lantern she had used on the morning of their first meeting. The hives stood wrapped in straw, their roofs holding narrow caps of snow. No bees appeared. Old Meg's faded green letters were partly hidden behind the winter covering. Agnes moved along the row without speaking. At each hive, she rested her palm against the wall and then bent her head. Her posture was exactly as Bertram remembered it from the lane months before, yet the sight no longer seemed mysterious. When she reached old Meg, she listened longer, then she stepped aside. Bertram removed his hat and leaned towards the hive. At first he heard the quiet of the orchard, a small fall of snow from a branch, the distant closing of a door, and his own breath near the wood. He waited without pressing closer. The sound emerged gradually, deep beneath the boards and straw, Thousands of bees formed a living cluster around their queen. Their wings were folded. Their summer journeys had ended, yet small movements passed through the colony as the outer bees exchanged places with those nearer the warmth, each life contributing to a heat no single bee could have made alone. The murmur was low, gathered, and patient. Bertram remembered hearing it for the first time and saying only that the bees were alive. He understood more now, though the simplest statement remained sufficient. They had stored what the warm months offered. They had been left enough. They had drawn close. They were continuing. Agnes sat upon her box. Bertram placed his hat on his knees and took the three-legged stool. Neither asked what would happen when spring returned. The blank pages waited in the workroom, and the bees carried the future in forms too small to be seen through winter walls. Snow rested upon the orchard. Beyond the hedge, Selworthy remained quiet beneath its pale roofs. No school bell divided the morning, and Bertram felt no need to divide it for himself. Beneath the straw and weathered wood, old Meg continued her low, patient humming, and in the stillness of Selworthy Combe, two people sat listening, asking nothing more of winter than that it keep what spring would one day require. And now, our story has come to rest. The snow lies softly across the orchard. The village roofs are pale beneath the winter sky, and deep within old Meg, the bees remain gathered around their patient warmth. Agnes and Bertram need nothing more from the morning. The book is safely upon its shelf. The honey has been shared. The empty pages can wait for spring. You may let the orchard grow distant now. Let the hives become quiet shapes beneath the snow, and allow their low humming to fade into the stillness around you. There is nothing left to arrange, nothing left to remember, and nowhere else you need to go. Rest gently. You are safe. The night is quiet, and sleep may carry you softly from here.